Hi, my name's Paul Marsh, and today I want to talk about terrains in Unity, a little bit of an introduction, because I think some of the terminology can be a little bit confusing. So, first thing to do is to create a 3D object called a terrain. And that gives us this big area here. So what exactly has it given us? So hit the little settings button here, little cog, and we come down here and you can see it's given us a default width, a terrain height. So this is basically a kind of 3D area that it's taking up, and then some resolutions. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So we've got a height map resolution, we've got control resolution and a base resolution. And I'll try and explain at least a couple of these ideas. So the first thing to do is we've got this sort of checkerboard effect. So you want to give it some ground. And we come to the little paintbrush here, and we can say paint a texture. And this allows us to see the edit terrains layer. So let's give it some layers to actually add. It's popped up in another window. Okay, so let's have a look at, I don't know, dirt. Dirt, ground dirt. Just choose this one. Okay, so here's a little terrain layer it's added here, and you can see that it's got this little sort of poorly tiled effect going on here, but you can see there's some ground on here. And what I like to do is just give it some height. So we're going to say set the height, and it's in world space. We're going to set it to 20, and we can just say flatten tile. So now we've lost that kind of grid thing, because now the terrain is sort of 20 thick in effect, 20 deep. Okay, so let's put a cube on here. So this is a 1x1 cube by default, so this will give us some scale. And let's take this all the way down to the ground. Just put it into the ground. Okay, so the first thing to say is that the terrain object and the cube object are just two separate game objects. They don't really know about each other. Just because this is in the ground, the cube doesn't know that, and the terrain doesn't really know about the cube. They're separate items. So what we're going to do now is I just want to make some changes to the height. So this in effect is creating what looks like a 3D object in the terrain, but really it's just a lot of height information to the terrain. So let's do that. So I shall do set height, and we'll give it a height of 30 now. But this time I'm going to use a brush. So this is a brush size, and you can see this little kind of pyramid thing that's appearing. And if you notice the size of the circle, it's roughly the same size as the cube. So what this really means is we can affect the terrain, but we're affecting it, and its minimum size is roughly 1x1x1. Okay, at the moment. So let's kind of try and draw something. So I'll try and draw something that looks a little bit like a square. You just keep getting the edges in. You can see I'm just changing the height using the brush. So setting the height to 30. So we make a kind of little square here. We'll just move the cube out a little bit. Okay, so that's set. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change one of the terrain properties. And the terrain property I'm going to change is the resolution. So we come down here, and I'm going to put it right up to the top. So it's on 513 by 513. I'm going to take it to 4097. So we'll just take a moment to do that. Okay, and you can see that our little square box height thing here hasn't changed. That's the terrain, remember? And it's still near where the cube was. But when I go to paint now, so we're still on the same paint thing, still using the same brush. You can see the brush size has automatically gone up a little bit. So we can move that down back to its kind of minimum. And you notice how tiny the brush is. So now I can make really small height changes if I wanted to. So that's the kind of difference with the resolution. So on our 1000 by 1000 terrain, we've now upped the resolution, which means that we can make smaller adjustments. Each little movement on here is now much more refined. Okay, so that's the kind of resolution aspect. So you may think, well, okay, what's the size got to do with anything? So you come down here, so you've got 1000 by 1000. Now, it looks like you could change this size, and indeed you can. So let's change the width to 500 and see what happens. Okay, so it's changed. Now you can see that the cube is now no longer on the terrain, because obviously the terrain is narrower in width. So we've kind of lost that. But let's go and look at our box that we created. And you can see that the box has just moved along and it's kind of scaled. So it's now longer than it is wide. It's no longer a kind of square. And that's the problem. So you can't really resize a terrain and keep sort of aspect ratio of everything you put on there. So one thing to take away from this is you have to really think about the size of the terrain you want right at the beginning, because it will just break things. Unfortunately, you can just go straight back. And we go back to the cube. And you can see that our square comes back. So it has sort of scaled it back. So that's quite good. Now, let's have to think about the relationship between the size of the terrain and its resolution. So we saw earlier that we had a large resolution when we could only make changes that were basically the same size as the cube. And when we up the resolution, we can make these tiny changes. But there is a corresponding relationship between the two. So we're now on 4097. So if we change this to 4097 and this to 4097, so now the terrain is roughly going to be a 1-to-1 match for the resolution. So obviously our square has vanished off somewhere into the distance. But let's have a look at how that's affected the paint resolution again. So we come back to our paint tool, and you can see now that it's gone back to being roughly the same size as the cube. So there is a corresponding relationship between the height and width of the terrain, the resolution of the terrain, and exactly how fine an adjustment you can make to the terrain. And really the takeaway from it is, if you want to make small, fine adjustments, then you need to keep the ratio of your height map resolution to your terrain width larger in favor of the height map resolution. And also, if you're unsure about the size of the terrain width that you want, then spend time up front thinking about it, because trying to change it afterwards affects all the changes that you've made to the height map. And that's obviously can be quite destructive and not what you want. So think about this settings before you start your project. The other thing to say is that this is only using one terrain, and you can create multiple terrains and join them together. So if you do have a large area, then my advice would be to keep this relatively small and then just create multiple terrains and link them together. That way you can have a relatively small terrain, a relatively high resolution, and still cover a large area. So the next thing I want to show is, okay, so you've got your terrain and it's 1000 by 1000, and we've got our high resolution here. As you can see, maybe not. You can just see here a little pyramid around the cube. I'm moving the mouse around. It's quite a fine granularity, so that's good. But what I want to do now is I want to be able to have that bigger terrain area, but I want to be able to have an even smaller resolution, or I want to just be able to have more terrains because it's slightly more efficient. So just to sort of bring home the point a little bit about the separation of terrain and objects. What I'm going to do is I've got something called the River Automated Materials RAM, and I'm going to create an object, a little spline in here. So create a river spline. And you can see we've got this big terrain, and I'm just going to start creating some points in this terrain, bring it back here. So this object is on the terrain because it's found the points by using things like ray casting, but it's not part of the terrain. So that's a sort of crucial point. And I'm going to use this other tool, this terrain splitter. And this is a separate download. And I'm just going to say split terrain here. Oh, actually I have to select the terrain first. Split terrain. And it's going to do its thing. What it's going to do is it's going to break this 1000 by 1000 terrain into smaller terrains, but visually you won't really notice the difference. So if I now turn this terrain off, you can see the river spline is still there, the cube is still there, our height map, little squared mountain range thing here, that's still there. But now we've got 4 separate terrains. You can see them here tiled next to each other. And if we look at the individual terrain, you can see they're now 500 by 500. So they're a lot smaller in sort of size, but when we come down to do our painting, all the way back down to the cube, yep, get our paintbrush on, you can see that it's still quite a small brush, and we can still make these little fine adjustments. That's all good. So we've now got multiple terrains. We can see that this river is crossing over the boundaries there. That's not had a problem because it's in its own world space. It doesn't really care, or doesn't care too much about the terrain. It's not sort of glued into the terrain in any way. So yeah, so now we've got more tiles of terrain to work with, which means in theory we can now, if we find our individual tile, this one here, and look at its settings, you can see that whilst we've still had a very fine paint area, our resolution has now dropped, so it's 2049. So in theory I could go up to 4097 and come down and look at our paint resolution again right next to that cube, and we saw it was quite fine before. So our brush, and you can see that our brush has moved up a bit, so 0.24 is where we were, so very fine. But now we can move it even smaller, and look at it, it's tiny. We can make really small adjustments to the height map if we wanted to. So that's, again, this whole ratio between the width and height of the tile to its resolution means that you can play around with exactly how accurate you want your, how finely grained you want your changes to your height map. Look at that, it's crazy. So I hope this introduction's been useful, and yeah, this, I'm going to say it wrong, is it Dvornik tool? You can just download that on the internet. You just look for Terrain Splitter, not from the asset store, so obviously there's a slight concern with that, but that's your choice really. I made that choice too. It's always a little bit of worry, but in fact it's literally just this script here, so it's not doing anything particularly naughty. So you can see what it's doing, and that's really all it is, just a little script editor. It's automating the process of splitting the terrains for you, and it works really well. You see we've got a little warning here about our neighbours being different height map resolution. So if you want to change this height map, you should really change all the neighbours as well. So that's, let's go and do that, just so I can get rid of the error message. There we go. So that should all be nicely done now, which won't be getting that error message in the future. As I hope you found that useful, and it's been a very quick introduction to the terrain width and length and the resolutions. Okay, thanks.